drift, standing out at the table, with everyone looking like people who weren't hostile, really these from the crowd around arguing about which one of them is the greatest. I don't say that to be harsh. I think most of us would have done the same thing. We don't always know what moment we're in until it's already past. Then in the garden, he didn't ask them to do something big. He just asked them to stay awake, to pray with him, and they couldn't even do that. Now the crowd comes. Torches, swords, and Judas walking up with a kiss. The one gesture that should have meant "I'm with you" had become the signal to take him away. Here's what I don't want us to miss though. Jesus saw all of this coming. He wasn't blindsided. He knew what Judas was carrying in his heart. He knew the disciples would fall asleep. He knew Peter would deny him before the night was over. None of it was a surprise to him. And he stayed anyway. That's the thing about Luke 22 that keeps getting me. Almost everybody around Jesus failed him in some way that night, and yet he kept moving toward them, toward the cross, toward us. A love that doesn't go cold when people let you down. That's what we're looking at tonight. Part 1. Betrayal was already sitting at the table. The first shadow of that night didn't fall in the garden. It fell at the table, and that's easy to miss, because when we picture betrayal, we usually put some distance in it. An enemy across the street, a stranger, somebody who never really cared about you to begin with. That's the version we're comfortable with, because at least it makes sense. But Luke won't let us keep it that far away. That Judas is not outside waiting. He is reclining at the meal, close enough to hear Jesus' voice. Close enough to receive the bread, close enough that the other disciples aren't even picking up on it yet. And that's what makes it so hard to sit with, because some of the deepest wounds don't come from people who never knew you. They come from someone who had a seat at the table, someone who'd seen enough, heard enough, experienced enough to know better, and they still made that choice. Now here's what I want you to notice about Jesus in this moment. He doesn't unravel. He doesn't start scanning the room with suspicion. He doesn't flip the table over and demand Judas confess in front of everyone. He doesn't even make a scene. He knows, and he keeps going. That's the weight of this scene right there. Jesus isn't loving Judas out of ignorance. This isn't some naive affection that hasn't figured out what's really happening. He knows exactly whose hand is at that table with him. He knows what Judas walked in carrying. He knows what's coming. And still, he lifts the bread. He speaks of his body given. He speaks of blood poured out. Judas is in the middle of selling him, and Jesus is in the middle of offering himself. I don't know how to fully explain that. The contrast is almost too much. One man at that table is calculating what he can get. The other is quietly giving everything he has. That's not just the difference between two men. That's the difference between the sin of man and the heart of God. So before we get to the garden, before the torches and the soldiers and the kiss, I think Luke wants us to slow down right here, at this table, and really see what we're looking at. A Savior who is not blind to betrayal, who sees it clearly, names it quietly, and still moves toward the cross for the very man who is about to hand him over. That kind of love doesn't come from willpower. That's something else entirely. Part 2. They were close to Jesus, but still thinking about themselves. There's a kind of loneliness that happens in a crowded room, and Luke shows it to us plainly. Jesus has just finished speaking about the bread, the cup, his body, his blood, the weight of what this meal actually means. And then, almost immediately, the disciples start arguing about which one of them should be considered the greatest. I've read that transition probably 100 times, and it still lands hard every time. They're not out in the streets. They're not enemies. They haven't left. They're right there sitting close to him, and their hearts are still circling around themselves. Who matters most? Who gets the higher seat? Who's going to be seen? Now it's easy to judge them for that. But I've been in ministry long enough to know I need to be careful here. Because if I'm honest, I've done that too. Sat near something sacred and quietly made it about me. Listened to scripture and caught myself wondering how I came across. Served somebody and noticed a little piece of me was hoping somebody noticed. That's not always loud, obvious pride. Sometimes it shows up as insecurity wearing religious clothes. Sometimes the person fighting hardest to be the greatest is really just afraid of being forgotten. Ambition can be fear in a nicer outfit. And Jesus doesn't respond like a wounded man who needs them to stop and recognize what he's going through. He teaches them. Honestly, that alone is worth pausing on. He tells them that Gentile rulers love to lord their power over people, but it's not going to work like that among you. The greatest among you needs to become like the youngest, the leader like the one who serves. They're reaching upward. He's showing them the way down. They're asking about position. He's answering with a picture of love. And that's where Jesus cuts against something really deep in us. We want a greatness that lifts us above people. He's describing a greatness that gets low enough to carry people. We want a name that makes people look at us. He's modeling a life poured out, even in a room where nobody fully understands what's happening yet. That night, the disciples were near Jesus, physically near him, but they weren't near his heart yet. And I think that's worth sitting with for a minute, because it is genuinely possible to be close to the language of faith and still miss the actual posture of it. To be at the table and still be asking the wrong question entirely. The question Jesus is living out that night isn't how high can I rise? It's something more like, how far is love willing to go, even when nobody around you is paying attention to what it's costing? Part 3. Jesus served people who still did not understand his heart. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't get talked about much. It's not the pain of being attacked by someone who hates you. It's the pain of being misread by someone who thinks they know you. Someone who's been with you long enough that you'd expect them to get it by now, and they still don't. That's where Jesus is in this room. These aren't strangers. These are the men who traveled with him, ate with him, watched him heal people, heard the same teaching over and over, and they still can't quite see what's actually happening in front of them. They're looking at a king preparing to go to a cross, and what they're thinking about is who's going to get the better seat at the table. Now Jesus could have shut down at that point, and honestly, we would have understood it. Most of us, if we were hours away from the worst night of our lives, and the people closest to us were arguing about status, we would have said something. We would have pulled back. We would have needed them to get it before we kept giving ourselves to them. But Jesus doesn't work that way. He keeps teaching. He stays patient. He doesn't say, you should know me better than this by now. He just keeps going. Keeps revealing what the kingdom actually looks like. The greatest becomes like the youngest. The leader becomes the one who serves. And I think that's one of the places where his love is most foreign to us. Because most of us need to feel understood before we stay gentle. We need some acknowledgement of what we're carrying before we keep pouring ourselves out. That's not wrong, that's just human. We have limits. Jesus didn't love from that place. He didn't need their understanding in order to remain who he was. Their confusion didn't make him confused. Their smallness didn't shrink him. He just kept showing them the Father. Some of you know what it's like to love someone who genuinely doesn't understand what it cost you. They've benefited from your patience, your loyalty, your presence, and they've never really seen the weight behind it. Maybe they're not cruel. They're just not paying attention. Jesus lived inside that for years with these men, and in that upper room, while they were still debating crowns, he was already quietly choosing the cross. Part 4. In Gethsemane, Jesus asked for presence and received sleep. Sometimes you don't need someone to fix anything. You just need them to be there. That's all Jesus asked for in the garden. He didn't bring the disciples there because they could change what was coming. They couldn't. He didn't ask them to carry the cup with him, or explain what it meant. He just asked them to stay awake, to pray, to stay close while he went through something he couldn't fully share with them. And they fell asleep. Now Luke actually gives us something important here. He says they were sleeping from sorrow. I think that detail matters. These men weren't indifferent. They weren't out there laughing somewhere. They were grieving, and the grief just became heavier than they could hold. At some point their bodies gave out. But that doesn't mean Jesus wasn't alone. It just means he was alone for reasons that weren't cruel. And sometimes that's its own kind of hard, when the people who love you genuinely can't reach you where you are. Not because they don't care, but because they're at the edge of what they can carry. Most of us have felt some version of that. You're going through something, and the people around you love you, they really do, but there's a depth to what you're carrying that nobody can quite get to. They're a few feet away, and it still feels like an enormous distance. Jesus knows that. So he prays. And it's not polished, it's not ceremonial. Luke describes it as agony, his sweat like drops of blood. This is a son in the dark, shaking, being honest with his father about how heavy this is. Not my will, but yours be done. I want you to notice where that prayer comes from. It doesn't come from a place of comfort. It doesn't come after everyone wakes up and gathers around him. It comes while the disciples are still asleep, while the human support around him is failing, while he is by every measure alone, and he still says yes to the Father. He doesn't wait for the room to be strong before he obeys. He doesn't need everyone present to keep moving forward. In the garden, love kept praying while friendship slept. And when Jesus finally got up off the ground, he walked straight back toward the very people who couldn't stay awake for him. That's not a small thing. Don't let it become familiar too fast. Part 5. The kiss made the betrayal hurt differently. A sword would have been easier to process. A stranger grabbing his robe, someone shouting from across the crowd, an enemy stepping out of the dark. At least that would have made sense. At least the shape of it would have been clear. But Judas came close. He didn't point from a distance. He didn't signal someone from behind the crowd. He walked up to Jesus and did something that in that culture was a gesture of warmth and respect, of friendship, a kiss. And Jesus looks at him and says, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? There's no panic in that, no breakdown. But read it slowly, and you can feel what's underneath it. Jesus isn't just exposing what Judas did. He's naming something about how he did it. The specific wrongness of taking something that belongs to love, a gesture meant to say I'm with you, and turning it into the signal that hands someone over. A lot of people in this room understand that kind of wound, even if the details are different, because the hardest betrayals aren't usually the loudest ones. They don't always look like an attack. Sometimes they come in a familiar voice, a soft tone, a gesture that used to mean safety. And what makes it so hard to recover from isn't just the hurt. You start reading, you start wondering what's real. Even genuine kindness can feel like a setup for a while. Jesus knows that feeling, not theoretically. He lived it in a garden, on a specific night, with a specific person he'd done life with. And here's what I keep coming back to. He doesn't harden. Even in this moment, he doesn't become someone he's not. Judas used closeness to destroy. Jesus is about to use his own suffering to bring people near to God. Judas took love's gesture and turned it into a weapon. Jesus took the worst night of his life and turned it into the doorway to redemption. That's not a clever contrast. That's the entire gospel, compressed into one scene in a garden. And through all of it, the kiss, the crowd, the torches, Jesus is still himself, still moving toward the cross, still not finished loving the people who are failing him. Part 6. Jesus did not let betrayal make him violent. When the crowd shows up, and one of the disciples pulls out a sword, I get it. I really do. When something you love is being threatened, the hand wants to grab something. The first, that's just being, doesn't only show up as physical violence. Sometimes when we're wounded, we go cold, we go silent, we build something inside us that says, I will never be that open again. That's a kind of sword too. But